Good morning and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church online as we continue and actually come to the end of our series looking at the life and story of Moses. Before we get into that, I've got a little quiz for you, a little icebreaker. Famous last words, and so I'm going to suggest a famous last words and whether you can remember and think about who it might be. So the first one is, "I'm bored with it all." Do you know who that was? Well, it was Winston Churchill. Someone else said, "Last words are for fools who haven't said enough." Anyone know that one? It's actually Karl Marx. Maybe you know one which there's a little bit of debate about. It's called "Kiss Me Hearty." Yes, that was Admiral Lord Nelson. Or what about this one? Perhaps you know it, I don't know. It says, "Put that down or you'll put someone's eye out." Yes, in fact, it was King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. I joke. Last words have significance, don't they? That's why they're often recorded, misremembered even, indeed sometimes even fabricated. They're meant to reflect something that's important from or about the person saying them. The message is meant to be left ringing in the ears of the hearer. And in this, the last of our series on Moses, we come to Moses' last words. And they are indeed significant. They're significant to Israel, and hopefully also there might be something for us as well. Moses knows his end is coming. God has told him that he will die before entering the promised land. We might get to that in a bit. And so he has time to put his affairs in order and to give his last words. And his last words are not some pithy catchphrase. In fact, they are indeed the whole book of Deuteronomy. So you'll be glad when we do the reading at church, that's not what the reading is going to be. Just recently, we dropped off our daughter Neve at university, and it's a familiar experience to many of you, I'm sure, dropping your child off to the next stage of their independent life. And there's lots of preparation, packing, organising, etc. But even so, as it came to us to leave her in her room, we still had the last few things in our heads that alongside the goodbyes and the hugs that we wanted to ask, to say, do you have this? Do you have that? Have you remembered? Make sure this, make sure that. It's what I would call the don't forget your toothbrush idea. Is that we want to get something across to our child. And we say all these things often accompanied with a roll of the eyes and an exasperated yes. We want to make sure our child is ready to go it alone without us. And this is the situation in Deuteronomy at the very start. Moses has led the people of Israel out of Egypt. From Sinai, he's given them the law, got to the edge of the promised land where the people essentially revolt and reject God. They don't trust him, they refuse to go in. And so they end up 40 years wandering the desert until they get to this point where they are at the edge of the promised land at Moab on one side of the Jordan River, getting ready to enter into this promised land that God has promised for generations. But Moses isn't going in. Now, Moses is going to deliver his parting words to Israel, the things he really wants them to remember. And I do encourage you to read Deuteronomy and notice just how much repetition there is. Now, this is not a mistake by the writer or the compiler of Moses' words. It's what we do, isn't it? We keep repeating, sometimes not even aware of it, the things that we really want a person to hold on to. And you get a distinct sense of Moses' desperation and wanting essentially the best for his children, the people of Israel. And his last words, the book of Deuteronomy, well, it's essentially a number of sermons within a sermon. And it's probably delivered over a period of time, probably maybe 40 days, not just one sitting. And it can be divided up roughly into a few sections, the structure of it. Chapters 1 to 4, chapters 5 to 26, chapters 27 to 30, and then the last words of Moses. But these sections, they're not just random. Experts in ancient Near East history recognize a pattern here. And it's got strong elements of what's known as a suzerain treaty. Now, this is a treaty that was made usually between two kings representing the nations. One who is more powerful than the other, the suzerain, and the other one which is the vassal state, a weaker, dependent, possibly defeated nation. And so we look at the first part, which is in chapters 1 to 4. which reflects the first part of a suzerain treaty. And the first part of these treaties usually involve recounting the shared history of the two states and the benefits that the greater state has given to the lesser one. And with Deuteronomy, in these chapters, we see Moses going over the story of the people and God. How God has delivered them from Egypt, has looked after them, kept them safe and secure, even in spite of their grumbling and rejecting of him over the years. The first part is the reminder of the goodness of God, what God has done for them in the past. And we see that particularly in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 34. Remember that this is a new generation of Israel. 40 years have passed from when they first could have entered the promised land, but they rebelled. So that generation, those who experienced the Exodus firsthand, have mostly gone. And the majority of people now had been born en route in the desert over those 40 years. They needed reminding even more of the amazing things that God has done from the start. And this, in fact, is a salient reminder for us that we need to remember the goodness of God in our lives, to remember and recount what he has done for us in the past. As we've mentioned many times before, these testimonies of God's goodness remind us of his love, his character, and they're often springboards of faith for us in the present and going into the future, into the unknown. But it's not just a reminder of God's goodness. Moses also uses the recollection to remind the people of what they have done, how often they have messed up. This is not to rub their faces in it, in the fact that they have a tendency to disobey, complain, and rebel. But it is a reminder that it's God's grace and goodness, his choice, that has brought them to having this land. In Deuteronomy 7, 7 and 8, Moses says, "The Lord didn't set his affections on you because you are more numerous or better than the people. In fact, you're the fewest. But it's because he loved you and kept his promises to bring you out with a mighty hand." It was to ensure that the people don't get ahead of themselves and think that they are special in and of themselves and of what they do. Firstly, it's been God's grace, his work, his love that's brought them to where they are. And secondly, they haven't got a great track record of obedience as a people. Now, reminding them of this fact that although they're a new generation, they have had the same tendency to repeat the same mistakes. There's particular examples. We look through the story of the Exodus where the first kind of generation of people coming out complain about no water, and so Moses, under command of God, strikes a rock and water comes out. Later on, 40 years later, a different generation have the same complaint, and it's what leads Moses to actually disobey God and end up being forbidden going into the promised land. They have the same characteristics. One pastor that I had often used to say, all we are sinners saved by grace. And I've known people who've not liked that because of a sense of it demeans who we are as people. And it demeans who we are as humanity. It lessens us. And I don't think it really does. And that's not what Moses is doing here. What he's doing is trying to be honest, trying to be real. We have a tendency in our pasts and even today to not follow God and his ways. It's a situation we find ourselves in today, as Israel did, as a result of God's grace, not because of our achievement. Often it's in spite of our messing up. This reminder of God's goodness and our messing up is honest. It's real. And that's the first part of this treaty, reminding of the goodness of God and our tendency to mess up. So moving on to part 2, chapters 5 through to 26, a huge chunk. The suzerain treaty, which Deuteronomy echoes, after listing all the benefits and shared history, it then sets out what the powerful suzerain overlord expects of his vassal subjects and the requirements of what it means to be under their authority. And this is where Moses spends a huge time going over the law. Now, we covered the law a couple of weeks ago in our series on Moses, but key things to remember about how we handle the Old Testament law is remembering that these were specific laws to Israel's context and stage of revelation of God. And we have to be careful not to compare them with our modern laws in our context. Actually, It's better to compare them to laws that were around in other nations at the time. What's really fascinating is the law of God has a higher level of justice and a much higher regard and priority for the vulnerable. But we also need to discern from this law the core of the heart of the law and the character of God before we start applying it. Start with the character of God. And so in Deuteronomy 5 verse 1 it says, Moses summoned all Israel and he said, "Hear, Israel, listen up to the decrees and laws I declare for you today, and learn them and make sure you follow them." And so Moses starts with the 10 Commandments, and he spends the next part of his final words going over the law that was given to the people at Sinai. Now, there is lots of repetition with parts of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but there's also expansion too. Moses expands and preaches on these laws. And you can imagine that the laws would grow and evolve and develop over 40 years of living and traveling as a nation and encountering other nations and peoples as they go along. And just after Moses recounts the 10 Commandments, some of the most significant words still revered in Judaism and echoed by Jesus later on is said in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." And then he goes on to say, "These commandments are for you to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them all the time. Tie them as symbols. Write them on door frames anywhere you can." And you'll recognize some of those words as the words that Jesus uses as the heart of the law. Love God with all that you are, heart, soul, and he goes on to say mind and strength. And this passage is called the Shema in Jewish religion. And Shema is the Hebrew word for listen. And it's repeated often as a touchstone of Judaism in their faith. But the word listen is so much more than just the audible paying attention to spoken words. It carries with it the compulsion to act on what you hear. And it echoes in James chapter 1, verse 22, where it says, "Don't merely be listeners of the word and deceive yourselves. Do what it says." And primarily the thrust of chapter 6 in Deuteronomy is the importance of keeping God at number one. And this occurs again and again through Moses' last words. Not being influenced or diverted by competing or inferior gods and idols and their associated behaviors. Be different to other nations, and you, in keeping God's will and reflecting his way at the very heart of your family and community life, make sure you pass this on to your children and to those around you. That's the second part of this treaty, saying what God expects you, and Moses outlines the laws. And the third part, chapters 27-30, is of the suzerain passage or the suzerain treaty pattern in Deuteronomy. The ruler would outline what would happen if the lesser party didn't follow the rules of the agreement just set out before. And we see this in Deuteronomy as Moses outlines all the curses which will happen to the people if they don't follow God's way. And it's very easy to read these as God's punishments for his people being naughty. But I think at the heart, and what I see and which Paul reflects also in his writings, is that these are the consequences of not following, for a better word, the Maker's instructions, God's patterns of life, and not following not following the consequences which come from those are often punishment enough. God outlines clearly how things should work and how they break down if we individually and corporately don't follow his ways. And yet we still often do it, and so did the people. And in a sense, people bring the curses, the consequences onto themselves and to those around us and after us. But what is a bit different to a typical suzerain treaty is that Moses also outlines the blessings, the good that comes from following God's ways. Now, this is less about good deed and reward, but more about living God's pattern. You follow this, things tend to work how they're supposed to. And it's important that we move away from this good, bad, carrot and stick, detention and gold star sticker mentality. Following God's pattern, things work out how they're meant to. Things don't fall apart in the same way. And that's the situation we find ourselves in even today. We could try and follow God's pattern, but we are still impacted and influenced by temptations for us to go our own way and by the decisions others make around us, which affect our lives. And the job of Israel all along was to demonstrate to the world, to the nations around them, that following Yahweh's patterns, the Maker's instructions, works, and therefore could and really should attract others to follow. Unfortunately, the people of Israel did not present this attractive image, and let's not escape the fact so often the church, historic and today, often hasn't either. So Moses outlines, particularly in chapter 28, the blessings and the curses, the consequences of following or not following God's ways. And in chapter 29 and 30, in the light of hearing the story of the goodness of God, what God requires of them to be his people, and then the relative consequences of following or not, Moses then lays down the fact that the people need to make a choice. Now, this may seem obvious from what we've covered already, but we could do with remembering this about the story, about the Exodus story, which Moses' words show here. If we remember the Exodus story, the people were in slavery in Egypt for many, many years. Now they are free. That seems obvious. Yeah, we know that. Yeah. But notice this. They are free to choose. They are free to choose. In Egypt, under the yoke of slavery, they had no freedom of choice. And God delivered them not to another form of imposed life, another form of slavery. He has brought them out in order to allow them to make the freedom to choose. And in Deuteronomy 30, he says, "This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you. I have set before you a choice, life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life." You have a choice. Choose life. And Moses goes on to say that for the Lord is your life. But notice it is not imposed. In fact, the ironic thing is that with freedom to choose, if the choice is to follow other ways, other gods, other idols, which they and we often do, it often leads to a new form of enslavement. And Paul refers to this as saying we are often slaves to sin. The sin habit which needs training, purifying out of us by the Holy Spirit of God. Sometimes it takes such a long time, especially with our disposition to go back to Egypt, to go back to our slavery, to go back to old ways and old patterns. But God has called us into freedom, but as a freedom to choose. And that is at the heart of that mystery, which is free will, the gift that God gives us. A gift which is a risky move by God, but which reveals his genuine heart of love, saying, "I love you, I have shown you my love, but I will let you choose to accept it or reject it." And Moses is so aware of this choice. He'd fallen many times too, and he knew he wasn't perfect. But he'd also seen over years and situations just how easily people strayed and the consequences of that straying. And so we see in the whole of the Torah, but more emphatically in Deuteronomy, Moses' repeated desperate pleas to the children of Israel. Please, for your own sake, choose life. He continually repeats himself. He tells them to write it on doorposts, talk about it around the meal table, set up stones when you get into the promised land and write on it the way of the Lord, his commandments. But in a non-literate society, he encourages them to gather together regularly every 7 years. And at this point to read the entirety of the law again and to give the opportunity to recommit to this covenant, the covenant renewal of God. So at the ages of 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, a person would always hear the law of God being repeated. He even gives stage directions for a dramatic retelling of blessings and curses on 2 different mountaintops, just to show the difference between the 2 ways of following God. He is desperate to get this message across. And then we move away from this idea of treating and this pattern, and we get to see a little bit behind the scenes in chapter 31, going forward from verse 14 onwards. We have an intimate, behind the scenes look at God and Moses after he's outlined these history, these the reminding of the way and the choice that people have to continually make. And the Lord says to Moses in Deuteronomy 31, you're going to rest with your ancestors, and these people will soon prostitute themselves to the foreign gods of the land they're entering. They will forsake me and break the covenant. Now, when we looked at the law a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned the fact that Israel's disobedience and ours does not come as a surprise to God. In verse 21, God says, I know what they're disposed to do. I know what they're like even before they get into the promised land. But what I perhaps hadn't fully appreciated until we look at these things, what we don't fully embrace, which I think is sensed in these words, is the absolute heartbreak that God has when his people reject him. Often it's language of, I am angry, but actually this reflects heartbreak. We see it more expressively put poetically later in the Old Testament prophets, particularly in the words of Hosea. And I think we hear them in Jesus when he weeps over Jerusalem, and then ultimately on the cross when he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. There's a heartbreak there. And there's a desperation in Moses' last words, which I think reflect in a small human way the depth of desperation the Lord has for each one of us when we make a choice which he knows will cause us pain and distance from him. And it's from the depths of that love and desperation that leads to Jesus coming among us and drives him to the cross. And so God, through Moses, pulling out all the stops to get this message across to the people. And as a last thing for Moses, God gives Moses a song to teach the people. Deuteronomy 31, he says, write down this song, teach the Israelites and have them sing it so that it'll be a witness for me against them. Now, when you read chapter 31, you'll see it's not exactly an earworm or a bubbly, happy, clappy song, one that will keep you singing all over again. I'm not sure it would make the 100 best hymns of whatever century, but it was a song written by God given to Moses to teach the people. And you know what it's like? We often use songs and rhymes and rhythms to remember things. The ABC song right through to the periodic table of the elements, because songs stick in the mind. And the people were to sing this song. And what a cracker. Deuteronomy 32, it covers that God is all-powerful, solid, reliable, and good. It says he has done great and amazing things for you. But you reject him and you go off with others. It's a bit like one of those Alanis Morissette breakup songs. It hurts God. And because of it, a lot of bad stuff happens as a result. And the ones that you go off with betray you. Happy song, eh? A top 40 hit, maybe? Actually, this is where the ancient Near East experts are a bit helpful again. This pattern, again, follows something more akin to something between a suzerain overlord and a vassal underling. We've seen already the covenant treaty pattern. The basis of this song is actually an echo of something like a suzerain accusation edict, a message which a powerful nation would send to its lesser one to tell them when they've found out that they've been unfaithful to their agreement. Moses is teaching this song to the people, which essentially predicts that they are going to forsake the goodness of God. But there is one big difference between a typical kind of accusation message and this song. And that difference is hope. And in it you get the essence of God saying you can always come home. When these gods that you follow let you down, and they will, when their promises are found out to be hollow and their freedom actually entraps you to them, you can always come home. In fact, earlier in chapter 30, Moses actually states this and predicts what will happen to Israel. They will end up in exile. And he says, when all these blessings and curses I've set before you happen, and when you're dispersed, and when your children return to the Lord, and obey him with all your heart, then the Lord will restore your fortunes. At the end of the song, God actually even says, I will make atonement for this land and people. Atonement, that's Jesus' language right there. I will make atonement for this land in his people. It's so good to hear, isn't it? Even when we have and do reject God, like the father in the parable, he awaits our return. And whilst this genuinely sounds like a great offer where we're free to mess up and then toddle back to a soft touch God, the truth is this costs God. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous theologian, talks about cheap grace, where he says grace is costly because it condemns sin. It's grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it's costly because it cost God the life of his son. You were bought at a price, and what has cost God cannot be cheap for us. Grace is never cheap. It's free for the recipient, but always costly for the giver. And so often, this is what God does. He uses a pattern of such a familiar human way, and then he twists it to reveal something unexpected. And the unexpected thing is his heart of grace and forgiveness. And God and his servant Moses don't leave things on this somber tone, because there's one more song to sing, and it's a song of blessing. As Moses blesses each of the tribes by name, it's a reminder to them that they are loved. Deuteronomy 34:29 says, "Blessed are you, Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord." And with that, Moses' last words end. And he stands on another mountain, these mountains which bookend his life of obedient service to God, a Sinai calling and a Nebo ending. And Moses can only stand and look out over the promised land. From the heights of Nebo, he could see land to the north, where Dan and Naphtali and Asher and a few other tribes will settle. He looks ahead to the west, where he sees the land that will be Ephraim and Benjamin and some of Dan's. He looks behind him from where they've come in the east, Gad and Reuben's land. And he looks to the south, the land of Simeon, the land of Judah, from where there will be a king who will rise. But it was a land he would not enter. We read about it in Numbers 20, 1-14, where Moses, because the people are moaning for water and God tells him to command the rock, Moses didn't do it properly. And instead of commanding water out of the rock, showing God's power and provision, he gets angry with the people, not really surprising, hits the rock and with his staff, and so it brings out the water. He brings it out, not as an act of grace and power of God, but of annoyance and anger towards the people. And him not getting into the promised land, it seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? After all Moses had been through, all his obedience, he doesn't get to go in. He's not happy about it. A number of times he brings it up to God in complaint. He holds it against Israel and blames them. And finally, after a number of times in Deuteronomy 3, God says, enough. No more talking about it. So is this harsh? Or maybe is it an act of loving kindness? So first of all, Moses was the leader. And throughout Scripture, God demands a higher level of accountability from those he calls to leadership. A thing that many Christian leaders throughout the ages, and especially with some headlines these days, need to remember. Kings and prophets. And in the New Testament, Jesus says it's very harsh on anyone in positions of leadership who lead people away. And Paul writes that those who want to be leaders will be judged more harshly. It's a message to the people that if God's pal Moses gets banned from the land of promise because of his disobedience, we all need to take God's warning seriously. But also it's not Moses' role. At the burning bush, he is charged by God to bring the people out of slavery to the mountain of God and to the promised land. He'd actually done his job. He was 120 years old. He'd done enough. What was needed in Canaan now at this point was not a father, teacher, leader, but a holy warrior, a Joshua, Moses' apprentice. And perhaps it was a mercy of God. After all the years of leading his rebellious people, he got them to where they needed to be. Admittedly, it's second time of asking. And God shows Moses the promised land, not in a kind of a rubbing it in. Do you remember like Bullseye, at the program Bullseye, at the end of the game, if they hadn't won the final round, Jim Bowen would say, here's what you could have won. It's not like that. What God is doing is showing him, here's what you have done. Here's what I have done. He's showing Moses he is faithful to the promises he always gave to his people. He would bring them to this promised land. And God saves Moses from having to see just how often and how much and how badly the people continue to fail and fall and rebel and reject God. And here on top of Mount Nebo, overlooking the land of promise, Moses dies, and how precious, and is taken care of by God himself. What an honour to one who the Lord knew, as it says, face to face. Moses could see where the people are going to go, their future. And he could also look back at how far they've come. And it's how far we've come in our journey in this series of Moses, his birth and early years, hearing about God's protection and his equipping of Moses in the courts of Egypt, Moses doing things his way and ending up being a fugitive shepherd for 40 years. His encounter with the Lord at the non-burning burning bush, revealing his call, but also his fear and his insecurity, his relatableness, and God's provision in meeting those needs. We have Pharaoh, plagues, and Passover, where Moses, even with his fear and insecurity, but with the power of God, faces the power and authorities of the large Egyptian empire and leads the people to freedom at the demonstration of God's hand. He takes the people to Sinai, is the lawgiver with the responsibility of teaching the people what it means to be the people of God. And he leads some rebellious, grumbling, and dissatisfied people who regularly and repeatedly kick against God and don't learn their lesson, which means 40 years of wandering until they're back at the gates of the promised land again. And we have said last words, a desperate plea using so many ways of asking the people to use their freedom to choose God, choose his way, choose his life. Now, Moses may not have entered the promised land with the people, but he entered there and then into the real promised land, the presence of God, of which the promised land of Canaan, it was just a mere echo. And again, of echoes, we hear echoes of Hebrews 11, the hall of faith, not the hall of fame, where Moses is referred to as an example to follow, where it says faith is being confident of what we hope for and sure of what we do not see. It's what the ancients, including Moses, were commended for. And at the end of this list of hall of faith members, it said all of them were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, just like Moses, since God had planned something better for us, that only together with us would they be made perfect. Over these last few weeks, we've looked at that story of Moses getting to this point. But a bit like a lot of the modern movies, particularly from Marvel, there's a post-credits scene as well. The story doesn't end there. You see, Moses did make it into the promised land. A cameo appearance on another mountain. And we fast forward to another mountain in Matthew's gospel. Moses is there representing the law, standing alongside Elijah, separated by centuries on earth. But here Elijah stands representing the prophets. And as they met, they speak with Jesus, the mountain of transfiguration. Jesus, the perfect personification of the law fulfilled. The hope Moses had of the people of Israel, which they never kept, is standing right in front of him and offers that life that Moses challenged the people to choose. Over these last weeks, we've looked at Moses' life, 120 years of his life, 3 generations of people, but one message from God. I have chosen you, choose me. We hope we've all garnered some new insights into the story and person of Moses, that we have seen or been reminded of the character of God and his desire to bring us all to a place of freedom to choose him. May we follow God's way and pattern as demonstrated in the life of Moses, but may we continually respond to the challenge to be God's people now, living the way he has called us to live in the here and now, to demonstrate his character to the world around us. May we choose life. For as Moses said to the people in Deuteronomy, the Lord is your life. Amen.